Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you so much to Grace and Teresa for inviting me here today, and thank you for giving up your time to be here. I'm going to give a little bit of background to my research and the field of book history, and then I'm going to get on with the talk. And then, as Grace says, there's two demos actually afterwards, one on making ink and one on cutting a quill and writing on parchment. And then, of course, in between there'll be time for questions and anything like that. So I'll start with how I first came to manuscript studies. My background in my 20s was working at the Tate Art Gallery. It's now Tate Britain, but at the time it was just the Tate Gallery, which kind of gives you an indication of my age. And then I worked at the British Museum, and then I kind of drifted into libraries. I had my children, and once I'd kind of, got them safely off to primary school and could get a bit of my own life back, I did the Library and Information Studies MA course at UCL. And there were two modules there, the Manuscript Studies module and the Historical Bibliography module, that really kind of paved my way forward. I then went on to complete an MRes on the history of the book at the Institute of English Studies, which focuses very much on the book as a physical object. And this is when I started to consider the actual physical properties of manuscripts. Book history is a field that has expanded greatly in the last 30 years or so, looking at the book as a physical object and examining its constituent parts. So this means looking at the type of parchment or paper used, the layout of the page, the type of script and or decoration, and the way it has been assembled and bound together. The life cycle of the book is also considered, including its ownership and examining the codex for signs of repair and rebinding, damage, additions, marginalia, etc. All the experiences of that book from its creation to the moment that you hold it in your hand, that are recorded either in the text itself or physical manifestations in the book. Analysis of these features, particularly at the book's conception, allow us to learn more about the process of book production, which in turn can lead to larger questions about skills, trade, network, and environment. Every medieval manuscript is a single unique object, sourced from completely natural products and produced completely by human hands. And it's a real snapshot of the era it was produced in. And since I started wanting to find out more about manuscript production, I've kind of find myself going ever further back along the process. I started then with illumination, where I attended a fabulous course run by Patricia Lovett, if any of you know her, on producing medieval miniatures. And this really sparked something inside of me, the fact that you could learn so much by physically creating something rather than just reading from a textbook, really made me want to explore more. I started looking into medieval ink production. And the great thing about manuscript making is that there are often medieval recipes or techniques surviving from that period. And they give the ingredients and the method and the weights, although they're often quite difficult to interpret. But you do have something there to work from, which is fantastic. Of all the processes that I do, making ink is the one that seems to have had the most traction, because I think it fascinates so many people and it's such a familiar substance to all of us. I'm very much focused on the process of manuscript production. The end result is almost a byproduct, although don't get me wrong, I do want it to work. But I'm not interested in producing the best or the most beautiful parchment or illumination. I want to understand what it's like to be immersed in this creative process. How does it feel? How does it smell? How does it sound? How does that close interaction with the natural product feed into my relationship with the end result? When I pick up a quill, I can remember the day that I went to the reservoir and spent a peaceful afternoon collecting goose feathers. When I use my woad, I can remember the smell of the lavender as I aerated the mixture in the garden. When I use my ink, I call to mind long walks in my local woodland in the late summer, wandering between oak trees. So I get such immense satisfaction from working with my hands and using only the things that nature has provided. And even if just for a brief while, I can connect with those medieval scribes and parchmenters who would have been following the same processes and experiencing the same sights and sounds and smells. Anyway, I'm going to stop waxing lyrical about what I do and why I love it so much, and focus on medieval ink. This is intended as an introduction, and the first part of the talk I will provide a general overview of the history of Iron Gall ink in Europe, from antiquity up to the present day. And the second part of the talk will focus more on the different types of galls, the nature of the Gall Wasp, and my personal experiences of making ink. So before the invention of the printing press in about 1440, the standard form of written communication in Europe was on stretched animal skin, known as parchment, using a goose or swan feather that had been shaped into a nib and dipped into an ink solution of crushed oak galls mixed with ferrous sulfate. The ink today is known as Iron Gall ink, a beautiful black viscous liquid that forms a unique partnership with the parchment, binding itself to the fibres of the animal skin, so that even after the ink has been erased from the surface, traces still remain, even if not to the naked eye. It seems to be this unique indelible feature that made Iron Gall ink preferable, especially for the early Christian religious texts that were intended to be long-lasting and durable. But to go back to the very beginning, the most basic type of ink you can make is from soot, from burning an organic material such as wood or bone and mixing it with water. Using charcoal as a form of communication goes back to the Paleolithic age, with Homo sapiens and possibly even Neanderthals using charred sticks for drawing on cave walls. From 40,000 BCE, there are many examples of cave art, and at some point our ancestors figured out that mixing charcoal with water and animal fat enabled them to make a type of paint. And I particularly like this example here on the slide, not only because the image of a human hand is such a tangible link to the past, but because these two colours, red and black, are the two most basic colours you would find in any medieval manuscript. Writers on papyrus and early parchment used a carbon-based ink as well. The Egyptians may have been using ink from as far back as 2500 BCE, and in China probably even earlier. As well as being mixed with water, it would have had a binding agent added, such as gum arabic in the western part of the world, or animal glue in the eastern part. This adds a smoother finish to the ink, allowing it to flow easier and stick to the surface being written on. Good quality carbon ink has a blue-black quality, which doesn't discolour with age, but it can smudge easily and is easy to scrape off from the surface of a document. There's a couple of examples here in the slide of carbon ink on Egyptian and Chinese writing surfaces. And as you can see, they've been preserved wonderfully with no fading or discoloration, although there is a little bit of smudging on one of the bamboo slips. In general, and I'm using the broadest parameters here, in the Western world, Egyptian and classical trained scribes would have used carbon-based ink. But by medieval times, Iron Gall ink had become the most popular, or the most common. But of course, it would have depended entirely on what materials were easiest to get hold of. And as soot would have been, I imagine, absolutely everywhere during that time, I'm sure plenty of medieval scribes would still have used carbon ink. And it's possible there was some kind of hierarchy and that carbon ink would have been used for less important documents, such as pieces of ephemera that were not intended to have a longer life. Visually, carbon ink tends to be very black and doesn't fade, whereas Iron Gall ink often fades to a browner colour, but not always. But for all inks, the chemical makeup of them is so variable that they all age differently. And factoring in all the various ordeals that a manuscript would have been subject to in its history, such as mistreatment, having candle wax dropped on it, being singed by candles, bad storage and horrible damp conditions, etc. Without scientific analysis with ultraviolet light, it's very difficult to say for definite what type of ink it is. And actually, even then with science, it's not always certain. There's a heritage scientist called Tia Gigo who's doing some great work on early Christian inks. and they are all largely carbon-based. But even with all of the equipment she uses, it's sometimes impossible to tell exactly what the chemical makeup is. And just to demonstrate how inks do fade differently, I just like to give you this example. This is a very well-known manuscript called the Codex Amiatinus, which is absolutely huge. If anyone saw it at the British Library exhibition, Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms, you'll know what I mean. It was produced by the monks at Wearmouth Jarrow in the early 8th century as a gift for Rome, but it went missing on its journey and then miraculously reappeared 200 years later at an abbey in Tuscany. Up until about 100 years ago, its English origins were unknown, largely because of alterations on this dedication page here. You can see clearly the change in the colour of the ink, and a brown ink has written the words Petrus Langobardorum, which means Peter of the Lombards, which is sort of northern Italy. So the darker ink has been scraped off, the original darker ink, and that removed the words Celfrith Anglorum, Celfrith of the English, who was the bishop who originally commissioned this manuscript. And so by removing his name and substituting Peter's name, it described the true origins of the manuscript for hundreds of years. I think one can assume that at the time the colour of the two inks was the same. They've gone to the trouble of trying to match the lettering, so I would assume that they tried to match the colour of the ink as well. And it's only over time that one has significantly faded to produce such a contrast. And I do particularly like they've kept the original C that formed the first letter of Celfrith and turned it into an E for the second letter of Petrus. And I just kind of like that recycling mentality. Examination of the Codex Amiatinus has revealed the presence of metal-based inks rather than carbon ink. So this is Iron Gall ink. So I just think this is a really clear example of how Iron Gall ink can fade or discolour depending on its original chemical structure, and it won't always fade the same. Anyway, just after that little deviation, I'll go back to the chronology of ink. We can look at classical sources for evidence of ink making. In his Natural History, written in the 1st century, Pliny describes methods for producing atramentum, which translates as a black liquid substance. He says the most effective method is to use the soot that comes from burning resin or pitch collected in purpose-built furnaces that does not allow the smoke to escape, and recommends pine wood as the best type of fuel. He goes on to say that for writing, it needed to be mixed with some gum. So at the end of the 1st century here, we have evidence of a dedicated manufacturing process for a carbon-based ink, which seems like on sort of quite an industrial scale. So it was obviously very widely used. But if we fast forward a few hundred years, in the early 5th century, Martianus Capella, a Latin prose writer of late antiquity, mentions a different type of ingredient used for ink, gall nuts. His most famous work, The Marriage of Philology and Mercury, is an encyclopedic didactic allegory on the 7 liberal arts, written in prose and verse. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go too much into the literature of it. But the 3rd book is about grammar, and this is personified as an old woman with a knife. At one point, the text describes how she, grammar, can assist memory and attention with a poultice made of wax smeared on beech wood and a mixture of gall nuts and gum and rolls of the nilotic plant. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that will have to do. And so to break that down, the wax on beech wood is referring to the wax tablets used at the time, as you can see on the left. The galls and the gum refers to the ink, and the rolls of the nilotic plant refers to papyrus scrolls. So this is describing the process of writing things down to aid memory. Although this poem isn't an instructional piece on making ink, through the use of descriptive poetic language, we can see that this new ingredient, gall nuts, is now being used for ink. We don't know how much earlier these gall nuts were being used, but clearly by the 5th century, it was an established ingredient. And actually later on, I've got a slide which shows Iron Gall ink being used rather than just a textual reference. But so this description by Capella does raise the obvious question, what are gall nuts? These are gall nuts, or galls, as I will be referring to them from now on. So they're hard, roundish growths found on trees when a gall wasp injects its eggs into the tree branch. When the larvae hatch and begin to feed, the tree reacts by thinking it's being damaged, and so it forms a protective shell in the area around the larvae, thereby encasing the developing gall grubs in a safe cocoon with a ready food supply. I often think it's the same sort of process as us. If our skin is being irritated, the way it forms a blister over that area, I sort of think of them as the same sort of thing, if that makes it easier to understand. When the larvae pupate inside the gall and become fully developed, they chew their way out of the protective shell, leaving the gall behind and fly off happily to pastures new. And none of this does any harm to the tree. It seems like quite a perfect symbiotic relationship. There are many recipes from the medieval period on making ink, and this is just one example from a manuscript from the 12th century. And this is actually a really great manuscript if you're interested in this sort of thing, because it has so many recipes and various art techniques, including Theophilus's text. But this isn't actually from Theophilus. This is just on a folio at the back, so we don't know who wrote this. But to sum up the first 5 stages of this recipe, first you mix up crushed galls with water, and that releases the tannic acid inside of them. Then you boil the mixture, add ground gum arabic to it, and boil it again. Now, I'm sure you probably all know this, but I'm sure you all know about gum arabic, but it comes from the acacia tree, which grows in Africa and Asia, and the gum is harvested by making incisions in the bark, which fills with a thick and frothy liquid that then hardens into droplets and dries out, allowing easy collection. I think you can literally just snap it off. This resin has been used for thousands of years as a glue and as a binding agent for paint and cosmetics, as well as ink. It gives an extra fluidity to help the ink to stay on the quill or pen and to flow onto the writing surface. And it's edible and good for stomach complaints, apparently, although I can't say I've ever tried it. Anyway, if we go back to the recipe, and we're on to stage 6 now of the process, and another ingredient, new ingredient, is mentioned. It instructs to remove the jar from the fire and take 4 ounces of vitriol. Vitriol is also known as copperas, which is also known as ferrous or iron sulfate. And that's why the ink is called Iron Gall ink, because it's got iron in it and it's got galls in it. In medieval times, you could make vitriol by boiling up rusty iron nails in water. And of course, you can still do that today, but you'd never be exactly sure of the strength of that solution. So I prefer to use ready-made crystals, and I'll tell you why that's a better alternative in a few minutes. The ferrous sulfate is what causes the chemical reaction between the tannic acid and the galls to turn it black. Sorry, the tannic acid in the galls to turn it black. And this also makes the ink bond with the surface and soak into the parchment, making it a much more permanent ink than carbon. And it's because of this knitting with the fibres of the parchment that even if the ink has been scraped off and written over, it leaves a kind of ghost-like shadow. When the text of a manuscript has been erased and repurposed as a new writing surface, it is called a palimpsest. And in a time when parchment was an expensive yet hard-wearing material, many monasteries would have reused old texts in this way. Sometimes you can see what the words are underneath with the naked eye, but luckily these days, with the use of ultraviolet light and multispectral imaging, it can be much easier to discover the previously erased words. There's some very exciting work going on at the Monastery of St. Catherine's at Mount Sinai with the Sinai Palimpsest project. the monastery was quite isolated from the 7th to the 11th century. And they've discovered that about 160 of their manuscripts are palimpsest texts, which provides a whole wealth of previously hidden knowledge, not only in the classical and liturgical texts that are revealed, but the wide range of different languages also bears testament to the connections between the Christian world at the time. And without this special unique property of Iron Gall ink, those texts would have been lost forever. If anyone's interested, there was a recent talk by Professor Rapp that's now available on YouTube, giving a current overview of the project and their exciting finds. So if anyone wants the link to that, I'm happy to provide it because I think it's such an interesting project. So I did say earlier that it was almost impossible to know by sight what kind of ink was used, but there is one unfortunate telltale side effect of Iron Gall ink, and this is why I don't boil up iron nails myself. Depending on the level of iron in the ink, it can become extremely acidic and corrosive and literally eats through the parchment or paper. You can see in this image the damage that can be done. Fortunately, this doesn't happen too often, and it depends on all sorts of chemical factors. But as a general rule, if you keep the iron ratio to under 1/3 of your liquid mixture, you should be okay. And I just want to mention here, this manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus, is from the mid-4th century. So here's an even earlier example of Iron Gall ink actually being used rather than Capella's 5th century textual evidence. During some research I was doing recently, I found some price lists for the cost of manuscript production from the Royal Collegiate Chapel of St George in Windsor. In about 1389, a bill was drawn up for the commission of various books, including a gospel. It broke down the total costs into an itemised list. Now, I'm sorry I haven't got a sharper image, but the grid on the right shows the cost of gospel production, including the price of black ink at 14p, red ink at 9p, and a bottle to hold the ink at 10p, which I just think is quite interesting that they're all quite similar prices. Now, it's hard to know the equivalent value in today's money, but if you kind of look at the ratio of all the other things there, you can kind of get a sense of it. So that the 19 quires at the top there, if you assume that the quires are made up of the standard 8 folios, which is 16 pages or sides, that works out as over 300 pages. So you think the amount of ink that would have been required to write over 300 pages, I think that would have been a fair amount of ink. So I think we can assume that ink was a relatively affordable product. And then I have another list here from A History of Agriculture and Prices in England, and this is from 1418, so it's about 30 years later. 3 pounds of galls, which is 1.3 kilograms, would set you back 2p, which, according to the National Archive currency converter, is £5.36. So that's a big bag of galls for just over a fiver, which I think is quite a bargain. And what I also think is interesting about this list, and there are others as well, that they will list the individual ingredients. So there's galls, there's copperas, and there's gum. So people were clearly buying these ingredients in bulk to make the ink at home in a domestic setting. So I think that's just really interesting, and it makes you think, oh, I wonder if they all had their own little recipes and things that they added to make it their own unique brand of ink. Anyway, it's pretty clear that Iron Gall ink was the most common ink in medieval times, but it did come with all sorts of troubles and complaints, and we have plenty of physical evidence from manuscripts to prove it. This famous image of cat paw prints on a 15th century manuscript is a lesson to us all about the dangers of wet ink and curious cats. I myself have also fallen foul of this when I was copying from a psalter one day and my cat swept through some fresh ink with her fluffy tail, leaving this horrible streaked mess behind her. So I know only too well how this can happen, and I really do empathise with the previous scribe. We also have comments from the scribes themselves. One 9th century Irish monk transcribing a Latin grammar book wrote in the margin in his native language, "New parchment, bad ink. Oh, I say nothing more." So I don't know why he's moaning, because the ink looks fine to me, but I guess we'll never know. We can also get an idea of the tools used by medieval scribes from depictions of them in manuscripts. This beautiful 12th century illumination of St Dunstan shows him writing in a manuscript with a quill in one hand and a knife in the other. The knife would have been used to sharpen the quill and also erase any mistakes from the top layer of parchment. And you can just about see his ink pot balanced precariously on the stand in the foreground there. In this next image, which I think is from the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, late medieval period anyway, we can see the scribe with two ink pots, one for black and one for red, which, as I said at the beginning of this talk, was the standard two colours for manuscripts. And you can see in the text that the scribe has been writing that those colours are clearly illustrated. And ink would have needed to have been portable as well for jobbing scribes travelling around. And as you can see in this enlarged image from this late medieval panel, quills could be protected in leather cases and ink could be carried in a container, also probably made of leather. It may also have been common practice to transport ink as a dehydrated solid to prevent spillages, which could then be rehydrated as needed. And even after the development of the printing press in Europe, with a new type of ink that suited printing better, Iron Gall ink was still a permanent feature on a scribe's desk. Iron Gall ink is no good for printing because it's water-based. You need an oil-based ink, which is much stickier. But yeah, but still carried on being perfectly good writing ink. In the later medieval period, paper began to be used alongside and then overtook the parchment industry. But Iron Gall ink is perfectly happy on both substrates. However, the easily reusable qualities of parchment don't quite translate to paper, as it is not possible to scrape off the top layer and write a new text underneath. So paper does lack those wonderful palimpsest qualities of animal skin. As well as being used as a writing ink, it was also the preferred medium as a drawing ink by many artists, including Leonardo da Vinci and Van Gogh. And we can also see how Iron Gall ink continued to be used by the scholars of the day, with Isaac Newton jotting down a recipe in his laboratory notebook in the late 17th century. His recipe is largely unchanged from the medieval methods, although he is quite heavy on the beer. He prefers to soak the galls in strong ale for a month and then add some more at the end. But, you know, he does quite rightly point out that water makes it apt to mould. And I would imagine that 17th century water was indeed quite apt to mould. And the alcohol acts as a preservative. He writes at the end, "With this ink new made, I wrote this," which I just think gives a lovely connection to the process. A short time later, we have this ledger belonging to Benjamin Franklin, who doodled on one of the back pages with a variety of different inks during June and August of 1731. It's such a pity that the recipes for these inks aren't written down too. But the last entry, where he writes B. Franklin's new ink, written August 3rd, 1731, he adds underneath "pale when first wrote," giving a lovely insight into the changeable properties of Iron Gall ink. So I think these show that Iron Gall ink continued to be an essential part of daily life. And it only really started to phase out during the last century, with increasing concern about the corrosive properties of Iron Gall ink and the introduction of better synthetic inks. And I would imagine with the increase in computers and the decrease in the written word as well. So I hope that's given you an idea of the chronology of Iron Gall ink. For the next section of this talk, I'm going to move on to the more natural aspects of making ink. So this is going to be less heavy on historic evidence and more focused on the natural world. Now, when I talk about gall wasps, most people immediately think of the horrible yellow and black striped nasty things that ruin our summers every year. But gall wasps are a different type of wasp entirely. They look more like small flies. They're sort of brown in colour, and most importantly, they don't sting. In this country, there are 3 types of oak galls that can be used to make ink: marble galls, apple galls, and nopagalls. There are loads of other different types of galls as well, but these 3 make ink. Apple galls, the ones in the middle there, are native to England, whereas marble galls and nopagalls have been introduced in the last 200 years. However, marble galls would have been traded throughout the medieval world, so medieval scribes in England would have known marble galls. Marble galls. I'm going to talk mainly about marble gall wasps because these are the type I know the most about and they make the best ink. And also because there are so many types of gall wasps, let alone wasps, that it does all get really confusing. And added to that, they have very complicated life cycles. So I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I can. For a marble gall wasp to breed, they need an English oak and a Turkey oak near to each other. In the spring, gall wasps will hatch from eggs planted on buds on Turkey oak trees. These wasps will be male and female, so this is the sexual generation. By midsummer, the wasps mate and the females are ready to lay their eggs. This time they need an English oak tree where they lay an individual egg on the branch. When the larvae hatches, it produces a chemical that induces the oak to grow a shell around the area and encases the gall grub in their safe woody nest. When the gall wasp has grown to adulthood inside the gall, it chews its way out and flies away, leaving behind a little round telltale escape hole. This cycle of gall wasps that hatch from the marble galls in late summer are asexual female wasps only. They will then need to find a turkey oak the following spring to lay their eggs, and the cycle begins all over again, which I just think is remarkably complicated for such a small insect, and that's only one type of gall wasp. But anyway, I do have a video here of a female marble gall wasp just chewing her final way out. Love the way she cleans off all that dust at the end. And then I do have another video here, which people always say is a bit mean, but it does make me laugh. And I think we can all appreciate that feeling of trying to get through a gap that's not quite big enough for us. She gets there in the end. So marble galls are said to make the best ink, although I've made perfectly good ink from other types of galls too. But marble galls are definitely the nicest to handle and they make the best lasting ink. They're easier to spot on younger oaks, often in clumps like this. As I said, marble galls were not introduced to England until the mid-19th century, but they were traded in plentiful amounts in the medieval world. And I just think that raises a really interesting question about the types of galls that would have been used in England. Would it have been more prudent to source the the native locally sourced apple galls that grew for free in their surrounding woodlands? Or would they have preferred to go for the good stuff that they could buy from town markets? I suppose in the vacuum of knowledge, I would suggest that it was a case of practicality and price. If they could afford and easily acquire imported galls, they would have done. But if it was there for the taking in their own backyard, why not make the most of a free resource? And possibly, again, there was another hierarchy where apple Gall ink was used for more inferior documents, and marble Gall ink would have been used for more expensive things. Apple galls are different from marble galls in that they incubate many larvae, as you can see from the numerous exit holes on this image here, sometimes up to 30, I think. These apple galls are very crumbly and spongy, and they feel much more fragile compared to the hard shell of the marble galls, and they grow in these quite irregular shapes. Like marble galls, they also have 2 alternate life cycles, but the difference is these ones only need an English oak tree. The asexual females that emerge from this gall will stay on the same tree, but fall to the ground to lay eggs in the roots. This sexual generation will then hatch from these eggs, and the females climb up the tree to lay the fertilised eggs. I don't think these females can even fly, so they're pretty much just stuck to the same oak tree. Again, the chemical reaction when the eggs are laid causes the oak to grow a protective home for these grubs, but one that is quite different in shape and texture from a marble gall. And I never find as many apple galls when I go out looking, foraging, but they do ripen in midsummer and they're very susceptible to the elements. So maybe by the time I go out in late summer, they've already largely disintegrated. I have made apple Gall ink, and while I was very pleased with the results, it did not last so well. As these writing samples show, there are close similarities between the quality of both types of ink. But when I checked the apple Gall ink the following spring, it had developed a lot of mould on the top. I removed as much as I could because the ink underneath was still perfectly fine, but the mould still kind of got in and added an extra unwanted granular texture to it. So in my experience, while fresh apple Gall ink is just as good as marble Gall ink, it does not keep as well. And you know, perhaps I should have heeded Isaac Newton's advice and added some alcohol to it, or even just some cloves. Actually, that would have worked just as well. Anyway, I'm going to come to the last type of gall used for ink, the weird and wonderful Nopagal. These alien-looking galls are formed when the Nopagal wasp lays its egg on a developing acorn, which then mutates around it. Like the marble gall wasp life cycle, an asexual female wasp will emerge from the Nopagal, which will then find a turkey oak in the spring to lay eggs that produce the sexual female and male wasps. So all of these gall wasps have these 2 alternate life cycles, with asexual females all being born from the galls, which then go on to lay eggs that produce both male and female young. The only difference is that the marble gall wasp and the Nopagal wasp life cycle alternate between English and turkey oaks, whereas the indigenous apple gall wasp stays close to the English oak. Like I say, it's quite complicated, but that's why I think it's just so interesting that they have this amazing, intricate life cycle. And then someone worked out that if you pick them and crush them and mix them with someone else, you get ink. And it's just something that we take so much for granted from growing up. We're used to seeing ink everywhere, but I just think it's such a complicated process that goes on just to get that piece of ink on a piece of paper. And I've also made ink from Nopagals, and again, it produced a perfectly acceptable ink. But Nopagals are really quite unpleasantly sticky and horrible to handle. And you do need to use them quite quickly after picking, otherwise they go mouldy. I left mine in the shed for less than a week, and by the time I went to use them, they had started to go mouldy. But they are probably the easiest to spot because they're so weird looking. Again, these are most prolific towards the end of summer and will tend to be higher up on the tree the marble or apple galls. Marble and apple galls tend to be on the sort of lower branches. And that was the ink that I made from the Nopagals. And just to finish up, I'd like to reflect on my personal experiences of making ink. Foraging for galls is one of my favourite pastimes. It's so lovely to wander around open spaces in late summer when you can just feel the season changing. It's something that has really connected me to my local landscape, and I find year after year I'm building on my mental map of the best places to find galls and revisiting the most abundant areas, and also not wasting my time on areas that I know won't yield any. And once I start foraging, I feel my whole body relax, and it's just a chance to leave all the work and domestic anxieties behind as I focus on spotting the telltale brown spheres among the oak leaves. Wandering through the foliage causes me to reflect on the legacy of the landscape, and although I'm concentrating on younger oaks, the surrounding mighty oaks provided the acorns that they sprang from. Bearing in mind that oaks can last for up to 1,000 years or even more, it's a comforting thought to think that those older oaks could have been around from the time of the Norman conquest, and that as saplings may very well have been host to apple galls that were collected for ink by medieval foragers. It's a thought that really centres me on the timelines of nature and contemplating what those oaks must have seen throughout their lifetimes and how their landscape must have changed over the years is really quite profound. Taking part in something that's been done for thousands of years, with the basic process pretty much unchanged, really connects you to the landscape and those that have come before us. And I love how these processes of medieval manuscript making tie me to the natural cycle of the world. Making ink is a straightforward process. You don't need specialist equipment other than what you would have in your kitchen already. And there's something really personal about making ink in your own surroundings while you have your everyday life going on in the background. It gives you the space to really engage with the materials and to use your senses to interact with the process, much more so, I think, than if you were doing it in a classroom or in an unfamiliar environment. And then you end up with a product that's really useful. And so I hope that's given you an idea of what an enjoyable process it is to make medieval ink. As well as keeping alive an incredibly useful tradition, it's a chance to spend time outdoors and get to know your local landscape. I have a website if you want to find out any more about the things that I do. I have got a discount price if anyone's interested. If they wanted to do my medieval workshop, ink workshop, you'll get a special ink making kit and a link to an instructional video. Or if you don't want to do that and if you just wanted a pot of ink, then let me know and I can send you out one. As I say, after this, there is a demo on how to make the ink and then a guide to cutting quills and writing on parchment. So I hope you'll find them a good companion to this ink talk. But for now, I'm going to stop talking, although of course I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.